Thank you very much. My name is Brett Harward, and I'm the CEO of a company called Bitesize, and I'm also an author and a speaker. I talk a lot about the psychology of how do you get people to move? How do you get people to move from point A to point Z? And so today I'm going to give you some tips and give you some ideas. I've worked with a lot of big organizations, so most of our clients are billion-dollar companies that have a challenge of either getting their customers to change behaviors, to adopt products, to habitually consume products. I do a lot of work with companies that have products they want people to use every day or as part of a lifestyle, supplements or vitamins. I do a lot of work in healthcare. So today I'm just going to talk. What I'll talk about will apply to every industry. It doesn't matter. Almost every industry. The final outcomes of most businesses are determined by their ability to get employees to behave in a certain way, to follow processes or protocols, or to learn new skills, or to learn how to be better leaders, and a company's ability to do that is what ultimately will determine how fast they grow and where they go. So I'm going to give you some tips today on some things you can do that will improve your training and your ability to help people learn and incorporate new things into their behaviors. So here's a couple of just thoughts to start with. The first thing that when I'm talking with a client that I always tell people is people are amazingly predictable. And you can count on basic human behavior to statistically override everything else in the long run. A lot of times, what organizations think are training issues aren't training issues. I'll give you an example. I've done a lot of work in the construction industry, and one of the projects I've done is the documentation work and what's happening on job sites, and the safety and keeping, and some very large construction companies. As I found the construction company, and they tell you, well, here's our current process, and when we're out there, we have our guys in the field, and they either take a camera with them or they take their cell phones now, and the way that our process works, as they're doing their work throughout the day, they're taking photographs. When they get done at the end of the day, they come back to the office, they download the photographs, our secretary puts them out into different client and project files. We send copies of those to our customers. And what I can tell them is your process itself won't work, because the human behaviors, all the things you require people to remember, all the handoffs that you've set in your process, at the end of the day, they won't work. You have too many handoffs, you have too many things, and statistically, people aren't that organized. It's not a training issue. You can train them on what to do over and over again, and they won't end up doing it. You can behaviors, because there's certain things that people do that are predictable. They can also be managed. As you start to be able to predict behaviors, they can be managed. You just can't ignore that people don't have ability to, they don't remember things. They don't do complex processes. They just don't. And the more complex, the more steps you make it, the less likely it is that they'll complete the process. Let's talk a little bit about what we do that's broken from all, and then I'll get into share with you some ideas about things that you can do that will dramatically improve your training and your transfer of information. And this will work with employees, this works with customers, this works with even with vendors, and it works on almost every topic. Work on hard skills like the two parts of a job. If you want to teach someone how the focus is on whoever has the information. That means if I'm the person that is the training manager, or I'm the CEO, and I've got the information of what I want to train to people, the focus right now is on what is the most efficient way for me to get that information to folks. If I'm a thought leader, so I'm an author, the way that we, as authors, that we get our information to people is we write a 200-page book or a 400-page book, and we give it out to people, and it's efficient. I mean, I write it once, and I print 10,000 copies at a time, and I sell them, or I give them out at workshops or seminars. Unfortunately, most people, they don't have the ability to read a book and digest it and apply it. They might, out of 400 pages and 200 ideas, they might take one or two of them that they actually apply and they actually integrate into their into what they're doing. Statistically, most people don't remember more than about 5% they read in a book, because we give them a fire hose of information, expect them to digest it. So what we do, though, is we do on-demand trainings. We do these ways to train. Now, we know, most people that I talk to, they know at some level that the training people that way, at the end of the day, people remember somewhere between 5 and 20% of what they're taught. And 20% is really high if you're really, really good at training and you have used fairly short methods of training. You can get people to about 20%. That's about as high as you can possibly get, even with interactive, really good presentations. What's amazing is that most companies, that still is well worth it. Even with a 10%, of the information being transferred, it's well worth it because of the upside of improving people's skills, improving people's job performance that comes. So let's talk about kind of why that's broken, and what stops people from getting success when we're giving them new information. So the very first thing is that the thought or the process of getting as many people together for as long as possible and giving them as much information as possible. That's kind of how I define that's the most common way of training people today. It creates a fire hose effect. We give them overload. What's dysfunctional about the current training process is most organizations, they get people together, they give them a ton of information, and they treat them and expect them to remember and be accountable for everything that they learned. So I teach an entire employee orientation, and I do it in 4 hours, and I expect them to remember and to apply and to learn, and then I get frustrated when they don't, because I'm like, dude, it was in the training. We already covered this, when a problem arises later on. The second thing that happens is we create thoughts, because we give people so much information. We create thoughts right out of the gate that are the conscious thoughts of, I can't do this, or I don't know how to do this. I don't know what to do next. I don't know where to start. We teach a lot of principles without clear hows and whats and whens and whys that are sustainable. So we teach people the ideas. We expect them to translate those ideas. So we teach, for example, we might teach them that our organization has a culture of innovation. And we teach the concept of innovation, but without teaching some specific principles, some specific ways, some hows and whats and whens and whys. Without teaching those, innovation will never take hold. People actually, I can create a concept or a culture of innovation that because the concept is so vague, or I can create a culture of trust, or I can create a culture of integrity. And as I talk about those values, most organizations have a very challenging time translating the values into something that's tangible. The third thing that is a problem is we ignore current habits. Often we take someone and we decide we want to teach time management skills, but the current habit is people are horrible with their time and managing their time, and so they're not capable of ever making the time to learn the time management skills, because they live, their entire employment career is lived in, being behind the eight ball, not having things completed, and we're expecting them to change their time management skills to learn time management. So we ignore the current habits that are in place. We just think if we teach people new things, they will automatically add new habits. We call those habit comas, because habit comas literally are when people are in those routines, they're not making conscious choices. They're going on autopilot. and giving them new information or asking them to interrupt that cycle, it doesn't work very well. We can look at exercise and eating as good examples of that. Most of us, we know we should eat better or be healthier, but most of us have these habits that we go through, and we eat more out of habit than we do out of conscious choice. And if we don't take into account what the currently habits are, it's almost impossible to get them to form new ones. So the habit formation. And the last thing that people do is they hype it. Instead of building the skills, they tell people stuff over and over and over again, but they never build the actual fundamental skills. They don't practice. They don't let people practice it and have successes. So let's talk about what works. And what we use something called a learner-driven model, which is the apprentice, or might be called the apprenticeship model. For centuries, it's been the best way of teaching and training that's ever existed. And in fact, using that model, most people are able to get pretty much 100% of the information to get transferred from one person to another. The problem is that it's horribly inefficient. It takes way too much time. In today's society, we are growing too fast. We're moving too fast. But the apprenticeship model is basically teach us concept, let someone go practice that concept and apply it. And once they've gotten that down, then come back and teach them the next thing, and teach it to them in smaller pieces with practice between, so that they can. And what's been shown is that even on a basic level, there's almost any skill that if you use that model for long enough, you can get 100% of the information to transfer. But even breaking that down, you get 60 to 80% of the information to transfer effectively, even though it's horribly inefficient. That's why no one uses this model. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to kind of imitate this model and to build some efficiencies today. So here's what works. So in order to change behavior, there's 6 principles that we apply, and 5 principles that we apply. Here's the five principles that are the thought process that kind of goes behind what I'll talk about today. The first one is to lower expectations. So the first thought is to lower expectations. One of the authors that I really like, he wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, is a guy named Daniel Kahneman, and he teaches at Harvard University in the U.S. and he actually teaches at a couple of universities, and he's a psychologist. He studies human behavior and psychology. At the end of his course, the students have taken his course. So one of the guys who's on our board is actually had him as an instructor, and at the end of the course, the very last day, he's done all this analysis of people, and he tells his class, he said, I want to share with you the biggest secret that I've learned in all the work that I've done in psychology. And he said, if you want to be happy in life, there's only one thing that correlates with happiness. And he goes on to say that the students are all sitting on the edge of their chair, and he says the only thing that correlates directly with happiness is lower your expectations. Here's what that means to me. The very first thing you do is you lower your expectations, meaning you expect the process to break. You expect people to not complete assignments. You expect people to forget things. When you expect it, when you lower your expectations, and you're not really lowering, when you bring your expectations in alignment with what is normal human behavior, you're able to account for, in your training process, you're able to account for the hiccups, for the breakdowns, for the things that people don't do. When you expect that you're going to give people a whole bunch of information and they're going to immediately take it and apply it and use it at an expert level, you're setting your whole training system up to fail. The second thing is to reduce choices, and that may sound counterintuitive, but psychologically, one of the keys to getting training to work is you reduce the choices, especially initially. Choices create confusion, and choices create the inability for people to apply things. So a lot of times what happens is you give people information and then expect them to go out and make a lot of choices. You're better. You'll find it easier in your training if you say, do it this way, say this thing, and you reduce the overall choices. The third thing is look at the current step only. Don't be teaching them things they need to know 3 months down the road or a year down the road, because people won't remember it. That's just human behaviorally, they will not remember something that's not relevant right now. So break the process down and teach them each principle in the exact order that they need it. The fourth thing is to reward leading indicators. So leading indicators will simply means focus on business, and most processes have funnels. Focus on the things at the top of the funnel. I'll get how to do that. Push information. When you expect people to go places, I've worked with so many huge organizations that have this massive video library, or they have a university program, or they have whatever, where they have hundreds and hundreds of videos that people can go watch. And the concept is, and most of them are just frustrated. I've never yet met one that with just that huge back end that it's highly consumed and highly used. Most people are so frustrated because they put a lot of time and money into this building a huge resource, but no one ever uses it. It's kind of like public library. Less than 2% of our population goes to a public library, even though most of us within, a short distance from where we live have a building that has all the information we could ever want to learn about anything there, and most of us just don't consume it. Here's why. Most of us don't know what we don't know. So we need to push information to them, because the people who know the information need to decide, here's the pieces and here's the order they need to learn it in, because the person who's the learner doesn't know what they don't know. Giving them a big smorgasbord and saying, hey, go pick whatever you want to learn. Well, we don't know most of that. And the final thing is to manage failure. So make sure your process right out of the gate accounts for drop-offs and failures. It's, if I'm, again, I'll use this analogy a lot. I'll talk about the training and how that works in a training environment, or in a, like, dieting, physical exercise, things that we all know we should do. Most of us have some idea of what to do. We just aren't good at doing it. We're not good at applying it. Well, the same thing applies to almost every business principle and every job function. The same concept. If you're going to have someone that wants to diet or wants to lose weight, one of the things you have to plan on to be successful is you have to plan on them having days where they fall off the wagon. And if you have a program that will account for that and allow people that forget or that miss a few days to easily get reintegrated back into the process, so that they don't feel overwhelmed, or they don't feel like they're failing, or like there's no recovery. When you make failure it's part of the process, and you manage it and can integrate people back in, then your training process will be much more successful. So here's what we found. So we've done lots of studies. We've done lots of studies with universities. We've done lots of business studies as we work with clients, and we're measuring, benchmark results versus ongoing results. We found 3 steps that work, and we call it the Bitesize process. But you can use it with just about anything, and you don't need us to use it. The first thing is present information in small, single-focused pieces. I'll explain why in a second. Create strategic builds to defined objectives, meaning take the information and make it so that as they learn the different principles, that at the end there's some objective that we want them to get to. So I might say, for example, that I'm going to teach someone a sales process. If you have a sales force, you might teach a sales process that throughout the sales process, then you can, at the end, we want people to be able to close at a 30% closing rate. That's the defined objective. And in order to have that, they need to have these 15 skills. And we're going to teach the skills one at a time and let them practice the skill before we teach the next one. And then we create an interactive engagement that promotes action. So that's the last one. So rather than just give people information and make training an intellectual process, focus on making training an action process, so that as people learn something, they can immediately go out and apply it. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. I'll talk about some of them that are more effective as we go through. And so the secret that we've kind of come up with is to take psychology and strategy to create content. So you make your content small, and like what I just talked about, use technology to create efficiency. The one thing that's changed in how we train is that we have access to technology at greater levels now than we've ever had before. Almost every person on the planet now has has a video camera on their cell phone. They have cameras. They have access to information real time, all the time, and so we can use technology to simulate some of the aspects of the apprenticeship model that I talked about earlier, and we found that to be very effective. And I'm not talking about just making things smaller and making things so that you're sending out 3-minute videos, but you have this big video library and it's all automated. You can go too far that direction as well. And then the last thing is to follow social rules. One of the biggest downsides of using technology is that I lose the social impact of training, which is a really important part. It's in the social elements that we get to practice, that we get to play, that we create accountability. And so when you can use technology and still be able to maintain the social elements or simulate the social elements of training, the impact goes up dramatically. So let me talk to you about 4 things that will kind of change how you see training. The first one is something we call the brain games, which is the neurology of how people learn. The second is what we call the psychology gauntlet, or the managing people's thoughts as they're going through the training process. The third thing is what we call habit comas, or habit comas are simply, how do I break or displace or disrupt current habits long enough for new habits to take hold? So the habit building part of it. And then we're going to talk about practice, some ways to get people to practice so that they can incorporate what they're learning and actually make it part of their day-to-day success platform. So let's talk about the brain for a second, and the neurology. We have 3 challenges with our brains. The first one is what we call short-term memory or working memory. Short-term memory it's in the frontal cortex of our brain, and it's the part of our brain that receives information and interprets information when it first comes in. Our brains, although amazingly powerful, also have some massive limitations. So as people have evolved, even 100 years ago, 500 years ago, the function of the brain and the purpose of the brain was a little bit different than it is today. We didn't have the masses and volumes of information. Our brain was designed to go out and do things and learn from what we were doing and be taught what to do in smaller pieces and to practice. Short-term memory has a couple of big limitations. It's not like a USB port, so you can't just plug it in and give it tons of information and have it accurately remember and apply all the information that has gotten downloaded. Instead, our brains can handle, the psychologists call it the rule of 7 plus or minus 2. That's the most common theory, which means the average person can manage, if you're writing training, can manage up to 5 separate pieces of information and be able to remember it well, long enough to get it into practice or to apply it. There's other groups out there that are predominant say, oh, we only have 2 short-term memory slots. From our experience, the best way to make sure we don't violate short-term memory is to teach single focus pieces where we teach 1. So our number is kind of 1. So when we're teaching information, an example of this, if I told everybody that's listening to remember the number 26, most of you would, if I asked an hour from now, would be able to say, oh yeah, the number was 26. If I tell you that I want you to remember the numbers, 14, 84, 72, 121, 13, and 11, most of you somewhere along the way will, even though that's not very many numbers, but when I hit 6 or 7 numbers, most of the time our brains will just you'll notice your brain will just click off and say, I can't remember all that. I can't remember that many numbers. The same thing happens when we're giving people information. If we give people training and we're trying to tell them, here's 21 things you need to remember, or here's 47 parts of your job that we're going to talk about, people's brains shut off quickly and they might remember 1 or 2. Most of the time, when our brains shut off, we don't remember any of it. We just kind of drop the entire thing. There's short-term memory. The first one is attention span. The average human being, our attention span over the last 10 years has dropped by 40%. In today's age, when we were watching information, when we're watching even videos or the news, you'll notice because our attention span is so much slower, we've got 5 things going on the screen all the time because our brains need faster input of information. The second thing you can do that will increase attention span is create relevance. That means you teach people something they can use today, which creates relevance. The third thing is only give them a single piece of information at a time to process, and that will increase their short-term memory. Once I can get something to stay in short-term memory for long enough to use it, by making it small, single-focused, and making sure that I make it relevant. If people aren't paying attention, by the way, their short-term memory essentially goes down to 0 slots. Our brains don't multitask. Contrary to what a lot of people think that they can multitask, we don't. And if we're in doing something like in habit mode, or doing something like driving a car that we just do on autopilot, we're not taking our processing to do that. But if we ever get in a situation where it's really rough, I live in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and if I'm ever driving in a snowstorm, I lose the ability to drive and talk on the phone at the same time, because it takes 100% of my focus to drive because it's slick or the car's sliding. The same thing if I'm on an important phone call, I have to tune everything else. I cannot be multitasking and having multiple conversations. Our brains don't work like that. Once you've got it in short-term memory, the second big brain game you got to play is, how do I get things into long-term memory? The best way to get things into long-term memory, say the neurologists tell us that to get things into long-term memory, what it takes is rehearsal. It takes rehearsal and repetition. If I'm remembering facts and figures, I need to go over them over and over again, and it literally burns a memory track in our brain. If I want, the fastest way to get to transfer something from short-term to long-term memory is to create an experience. The more senses we involve in the experience, so if we create an experience where people, they see things, they touch things, they smell things, they feel things, the more tracks that we have, the more sensory tracks we have. Each sensory track in our brain writes a new memory track. And the cool part about them is that they all become connected, though. So I can call up any track, and it will connect to all the other tracks. It's interesting. One of the studies that they did, while they were teaching some jet engine repair to mechanics that were working on jet engines, they put a certain smell in the room, and they put a unique smell in the room while they were teaching these concepts. They found later that when they were working on the jet engines, their ability to remember how to do it was increased by about 30% when they put that same smell into the room where they were working on the jet engines, because they were able to access their long-term memory. They were able to access through their sensory tract of smell. That unique smell was connected to all the other things that they were learning, and so when they could access that through smell, they were far more likely to remember all the other information as well, because our long-term memory is all connected like that. The third thing is habit formation. Our brains like habits. Our brains like the efficiency of not having to make decisions and go through the thought process. They're basically lazy. So when we recognize the processes of habit formation, and there's basically 3 processes. We did a whole workshop just on this. There's 3 processes of habit formation. The first is there's got to be triggers. There has to be a set routine, and there has to be a reward at the end of the routine. When our brains find those cycles where there's a clear trigger that can initiate some routine, and at the end of the routine they get some reward, our brains we don't choose our habits. Our brains choose our habits. Our brain will say, hey, this is one I can do regularly, and I can have success with it. So putting information in packets that have those features becomes important in the habit formation side of things. I'm going to shoot through the rest of these really quick, and then we'll kind of wrap up. We've got about 5 more minutes here. The second piece is to manage the thoughts. As you're teaching and training, there's 2 types of thoughts that emerge, basically, that we call it, and that's kind of my definition of the psychology element. I can create I can't or I don't know thoughts. When people say, wow, this is a lot of work, it's like asking someone to clean their entire house. And most people, the reason they don't, even though they want to or they see it as a job and they can do every one of the individual aspects, the thought of all the things they have to do or clean to get their house completely spotless is overwhelming, and they don't do anything. Versus when I tell someone, okay, start by picking up your towel and go hang up your towel. And then now just the dishes that are in the sink, let's just clean the dishes that are in the sink. And people can say, okay, I can do that. I can do that. I can do that. Ultimately, this is one of the keys to successfully training is create a series of I can thoughts. I can do that. I can do that. I can do that. And then as they have successes, you can use confidence to get people to take stretches or to do things they normally would not do by taking small baby steps. The third thing is to have identify current habits. Make sure you've got processes in place that will disrupt current habits. Sometimes you can just set alarms or have something, in the morning. I tried to stop eating after 8 o'clock at night about 6 months ago, and it was really hard for me because I had these habits, and at 9 o'clock at night I'd find myself down in my kitchen eating something without even being aware I was doing it. And so I had to start setting alarms on my phone, and my alarms would beep and say, okay, you're not eating. And I found out just one alarm didn't work that well for me. But if I could disrupt it, even for a couple days, I could reintegrate some new habits, and eventually the new habits would displace the old ones. But I had to find a way to kind of wake me up a little bit as I was going through the process, and finally add practice. So as you teach new concepts, think in terms of what could they do that would allow them to practice this, and they can role play it. They can look for conversations. Most of the time they can integrate the practice right into their daily schedule. It doesn't have to take a lot of time, but as you integrate the practice into the concepts, it's the practice that will move things from short-term to long-term memory. Okay, and it's the practice that becomes the single most important part of training. It's the having the experience of doing it a different way. So here's the even online training falls into the same category. Most of it is user initiated. There's not a lot of social component to it, and usually it's information based. It's giving people a ton of information without an experience behind it, without practice, and usually it's still in too big of pieces, and they violate the neurology and the psychology rules that we just talked about. So here's the summary. Here's kind of the guts of this. Make small trainings that are distributed over time and that work better. Establish cues and triggers. So look for opportunities. It's better to say something during the day. If you wanted to create a behavior of someone spending 10 minutes a day for self-improvement, if you tell them sometime during the day, spend 10 minutes and read a book or look something up online and learn something every day, almost nobody will end up doing it because there's no cue or trigger. If I'm actually better off, even though it's counterintuitive, to say every morning at 8:15, spend 10 minutes and do this, or every morning as soon as you finish breakfast, or every morning right before you go to bed, or the second you wake up. When I establish a trigger that's a solid trigger, I can start building behaviors and habit formation on a trigger. Giving people just to do this time isn't a trigger, and because of that, most people won't ever integrate it. Teach behaviors. Behaviors translate better than concepts. I can teach someone how to have integrity or how to be innovative. I'll be far more effective if I say these 7 behaviors, these 7 specific things we do are ways to translate, or are the way that we translate the concept of innovation, or the concept of integrity, or the value of trust in our work environment. As I break it into behaviors, people can experience the behavior and incorporate it, and they will naturally expand it to other behaviors. But breaking down concepts into behaviors concepts into behaviors is more effective than just teaching a concept. And finally, lower expectations. Expect people to have breakdowns. Expect people will forget things. Expect that people won't follow through. Here's the biggest testament. I know I'm coming up on we're coming on a question and answer period, but here's the big testament to the approach and what we do. Over the last 10 years, I've done individual trainings with thousands and thousands of people. In one of the trainings that I do, as we're walking people through this process of learning new behaviors, statistically, the thing that people are most afraid of everything that you can ask someone to do, what most people are afraid of is speaking in public. It actually ranks higher than death. Most people are more afraid of speaking in public than they are of dying. The only reason that speaking in public got rated #1 as people's biggest fear is because one of the questions wasn't singing in public. And if you would have put singing in public on the question, that would have easily ranked #1 over speaking in public. Over the last 10 years, as I followed this process in training, I've had thousands of people who have gone through a training course that I offer. At one point, we're looking at ways to get people to go through and getting your employees to do that, to behave like that, getting your customers, that's the key to being successful. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up for questions. If you guys have some questions, and I can give you some examples as well if you'd like.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Harward. Folks, we are now open for question and answers. If you have any questions, you can either put it in the question box or you could raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on your webinar console, so if you click on it, you can have a direct audio chat with Mr. Brett Harward. So let me go straight to the question box. There are a few questions already posted. The first one, how do you lower your expectations? While you may be anticipating something normal and easy to adapt as a senior executive, while a junior staff member might be considering it quite challenging to adjust.
So the biggest thing to lower your expectations about, and I'm not talking about like expecting people to not be smart or to not, but the basics. Lower your expectations on the basics, which means don't expect if you're going to teach people 25 things that they're going to remember all of them. I mean, create reminders, create opportunities to relearn it or to break it down into smaller pieces. Don't expect that people, I just don't expect people to remember things. That's like one of my ways of lowering expectations is that I can have a conversation with someone and say, hey, we're going to have a meeting tomorrow at 3 o'clock. I don't expect them to remember that we just set a meeting for tomorrow at 3 o'clock. So that's where I go in and I put in a reminder. And it's what you guys are doing all the time is we're doing these webinars and we'll have a discussion about what time we're going to do something. Right as soon as we're done, I get an email from you guys saying, okay, this confirms what we're talking about, and we put it in my schedule, and my alarm's going off this morning saying, hey, Brett, don't forget you've got the webinar with Miles this morning. It's like create all those backups and don't expect everybody just to remember everything, because you'll have a webinar and your speaker won't show up if you do that, because some people are just going to forget. Does that make sense? So from that aspect, that's what I mean when I say lower the expectations. Don't expect everybody to be perfect at remembering things. Don't expect everybody to be perfect at following through and being consistent. Give them reminders, give them tips, give them help, give them things that will help them remember and break it down into smaller pieces.
Okay, thank you very much. There's another one, short one. What are some of the key soft components one should look into from audience perspective while designing a training program module?
Well, here's one of the great things about this. One of the things I'm talking about is the way most people design their curriculum. They design these massive programs. They'll take their entire sales process and try and break it into a training and that they can teach over 2 or 3 days, or they try and take their whole leadership skills and they think there's some formula. The great thing about this idea is that I can take it in smaller pieces. So I recently had one of my clients that one of their big problems is culturally, it was a big hospital system, and culturally they had listening issues in that they didn't feel like the doctors and nurses listened to each other. They're all very smart groups, but they didn't tend to listen well. So they wanted to build the skills of listening, and they'd been working on it for a year with zero headway, because they were taking this big concept of, actually they were teaching this concept of, we need to create a more cooperative environment. And one of the skills they wanted to do was listening. That was too big of a piece as well. So we broke it into, we were able to say, listen, we're going to teach you a process of 4 different questions you can ask, that we want to have this asked 100 times a day, 1,000 times a day in our hospital system. And the first question is, I don't understand what you're doing. Explain it to me again. Or, I don't understand. I must be missing something. That was one of their questions. And we taught 4 questions, and we taught how to ask those questions. It dramatically changed their culture, because we took this big concept, which was where people aren't cooperating, they're not working together. And we broke it down into, where we've got these 3 questions that would help people cooperate and work together. And we taught the behavior of asking those questions. And that worked better than and you can make it, you can be adapting all the time and saying, okay, here's an area where we're weak. Let's come up with some specific behaviors we can do that can overcome that one weakness. And I don't have to come up with this entire big cultural training at one time. I mean, there will be times that you do some big chunks, but the small chunks can be inserted all the time. And so a lot of the soft skills are things like listening, like leadership, like getting other people's perspectives, delegating, time management. I mean, there's actually a really finite set of skills that you can kind of start off on one level and then go deeper and deeper and deeper.
Okay, thank you very much. Another one, what are your views on psychometric assessments? Are they really effective in assessing competencies, or they're just commercial tools?
Well, the big questions for me always come is I love some of the tools that are out there, and the problem is that most people, they get the information back, and now they have the information, but if you don't use it for something, if you don't take around and have strategies and use it, for example, to improve your training or improve the method that you teach someone, or that you manage them, or that you motivate them, if you don't use them, the information itself doesn't mean a lot. And where I find a lot of problems is that people do these assessments, and they kind of do them once, and they maybe use them to put people in certain positions where they might work better, or in certain roles or functions, but they don't really take advantage of it or use the information for those assessments to improve people's skills, or to improve their capacity. They see them more as a fixed, this is just who they are, and in that sense, you still are missing the big outcome, which is, how do I move them from point A to point Z? How do I consistently move large groups of people through a process so they become better? And a lot of times the assessments become more fixed. They become labels, and that's where I kind of struggle with them, because you don't solve the core end problem with those.
Okay, thank you very much. Another one, what skill set would you look the most for while hiring the learning and development head of any organization?
The biggest skill that I see is the ability to think simply. So a lot of times, as I'm working with these HR departments, they have these problems that are big, complex problems, and they're trying to solve them they tend to they need to be able to think simply without oversimplifying, and that's a really unique skill set. So taking a complex process, seeing the complexity of the process and understanding the complexity, but then be able to go back and break the process down into small, trainable steps that the masses can take, and making it so that the simple steps add up to solve the complex problem. When people that think like that are able to do, they're able to do a much better job than folks that get in and they're full of all the theory and all the the ideologies, and they want to teach them, and they just expect people to incorporate and adapt everything they hear. The folks who do that are not nearly as successful. So I've worked with a couple over the last 10 years that are amazing at taking complex ideas and breaking them down into simple components. And that's kind of probably the single biggest trait I would look for.
Thank you very much. Any tools that you would recommend for behavioral assessment from training need analysis perspective?
I don't know of any tools that just that in and of themselves. I mean, it's something that a lot of outside consultants are actually. Outside consultants often come in and ask the right questions that will kind of drive what are the behavioral outcomes that we want. What do we need people to do to change our culture or change our outcomes? And and then the process that I taught, once you've identified, here's the change we want to have happen. In our ideal world, people will do this or behave like this or interact with each other like this. Then the next step is just to break down what specific things do they need to learn in order to make that transition. And I don't know that this is so counter to current thinking and training that I don't even know of any tools that will help break that down like that. I don't know of.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Harward. That really brings us towards the end of the webinar. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss that?
No, thank you for the opportunity. I've enjoyed presenting to you guys. Let me know if there's anything else that I could do or more information. I'll send you guys my information. I'm happy if people have specific questions or want to have individual discussions with me. I'd be thrilled to take 15 or 20 minutes and chat with folks and share kind of ideas and help them start down this path if it's something that they think makes sense for them.
Thank you very much, and I really want to thank you on behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship for your time and for giving this live webinar through our platform. So once again, thank you very much, and thank you all of those who participated in this webinar and for your questions. We are recording this, so please stay tuned to webinar.mile.org to download the recorded versions and also to learn about our upcoming webinars. With that note, we'd like to end this webinar. You all will be automatically dismissed out. Thank you very much. You all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling from. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.